There were high hopes in some circles for Copenhagen, which was to look ahead to what comes after Kyoto. And it wasn't entirely a failure. So here is a sort of upbeat view of Copenhagen. What emerged from it was not what had been hoped, but what is called an accord, a set of promises and aspirations. There was a recognition, first, that it will be dangerous if we're below a further 2 degrees further rise in temperature by 2050. It was agreed that the science now tells you you need such deep cuts. It was agreed that action sooner is more effective than action later, because once you put it up there, on average, the molecule of CO2 is up there for a century. And it was agreed that it's a not easy set of aims to achieve. The Accord had recommended actions for developed countries as distinct from recommended actions from developing countries, and you can read that. One of my pet hates is people putting up slides and then reading them on the assumption that they could read it out loud faster than you can read it. To take the developed countries first, they're supposed by this particular date, 31st of January, to give their targets submitted, which the UK was able to do, but most of the others didn't manage to do that, but have done it since. And the developing countries are asked to put forward projections for what they're intending to do, and that is quite interesting, what has actually happened. And if I could find it on my notes, I could summarise it. China, for example, not on the 31st of January, but at least on the 9th of March, which wasn't too bad, brought forward its set of targets, which are quite interesting in that they're quite serious, and China is really committing to the science and technology of recognising the problems they have. And here, this is purely personal speculation. Not all of this is threat. Much of this is opportunity. Because just as the world of the post-industrial revolution was unimaginably different from the world of windmills and water wheels before it, so too there is going to be, eventually, there is going to be a post-carbon world. It's going to be a world of technologies that don't put greenhouse gases up. How many people will be left to enjoy it and how big a mess we'll make before we get there. That world is going to come, and the winners in it, just as the Industrial Revolution transformed many aspects of the power standings of nations, this coming transformation is going to transform them again. And it's not at all clear. At the moment, we have the two biggest powers, China, saver and exporter, part of the interplay of the financial crisis, and America, spendthrift and importer, but still technological leader. You may very well have China taking the technological lead as well. And the things they are doing, just even in looking at the implications of climate change on military conflict, is fascinating and not to be found in the armed services of the West. Now, there are threats and opportunities here. Developed countries have also agreed to provide new resources as part of the recognition of the fact that 80% of the greenhouse gases that are up there were put there by the developed world. The notion that immediately everybody should be cutting to the same extent, which is not at all part of the British thing. As I said, China and India are moving up to the fair share while we move way down. in the fair share world. And whether we will actually see this money committed is again another question. You'll remember many years ago there was a commitment by the OECD to put 0.7% of GDP annually into international aid to the developing world. And there are 5 countries that are doing that. Luxembourg, Netherlands, and 3 Scandinavian countries. The US, on the other hand, in public money is putting in 0.15%, and Germany, France, Britain are about 0.35. So I suspect a similar pattern will emerge here. And there'll be another assessment then made in 2015, and it may well, there are those who feel by that time it will be aiming even more ambitiously, which will be even more difficult. Just to round off by observing just what is the balance of activity, here are the world's 10 top emitters, and the reason there are 11 colours there is there's both the EU, there are 11 there because there's other, and there's the top 10. This is everybody but the top 10, and this is China, the US, the EU, Brazil, and so on. Australia, with 0.5% of the world's population, is 1% of the problem. So if you take satisfaction in punching above your weight, you're punching above your weight for the problem, though not nearly as much as the US, with 5% of the world's population and 16% of the problem. And here's how we've changed between 1990 and 2005. China industrializing, and although the total has now just gone above the US, remember the per capita thing is still hugely different, and the US is still getting worse. The EU is slightly getting better, and so it goes. Australia, in proportion, is getting worse at roughly the same rate as the US. What is important is both to curb the growth in emissions, to do it soon, and to do it fast. And what's happened next? Well, for all the countries that came together in Copenhagen, the next big meeting is in November, December this year in Mexico. For the G20, in the meanwhile, there are scheduled meetings, and the G8, a quite major meeting coming up in mid-June. And for the UK, more narrowly, we'll be putting the 4th budget for 2023 to 27 we put before Parliament in the middle of next year. Quick government response and a new set of targets, and we'll be having our 2nd annual report at the end of this year. I'll leave you with the slide that was my summary slide, in a sense, for the Lowy Lecture 2007. This is not some touchy-feely greeny slide. This is the UK Ministry of Defence slide. And it shows in the indicated areas and different colour coding, places under serious stress, much of it climate change produced, but not all of it, water scarcity, crop problems, hard to distinguish that from hunger, coastal risk from rising sea levels, and some just other problems like too many people. Well, that's also a problem for climate change, because actually the per capita reduction in emissions, if you've set a target, it depends on how many capitas there are in the country, what the country's got to be aiming for. And that's something that the Australian Academy of Sciences next year around this time, as it has its annual general meeting, is going to have as its themed meeting accompanying that a discussion about what is the interplay between the population, the foreseen population of Australia in 2050 and the climate change targets. It's an interesting thing that most people feel is too awkward to discuss, and I think the Academy is to be praised for trying to make it centre stage. The asterisks are centres of recent violent conflict. and there's a quite significant correlation, and you could say it's correlation without causation, but I think it's unlikely. And that's already, I talked too long, and now I'm stopping.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions in the room, but I might just abuse my privilege and ask the first one. For me, the most interesting thing about the presentation that you just gave was your observation that it might be action on climate change that is a major factor in the rise and decline of powers into the future, and which powers take the lead and which don't. I wonder, given that you're a member of the House of Lords in the UK, whether you'd reflect on whether it's the case that democracies might be a bit disadvantaged in dealing with climate change because they allow room for scepticism and obstructionism and generally slowing things down.
I think you're right. I mean, I think one of the hopeful things about countries, particularly like China, is when they decide to do something, they don't have to muck around persuading people to do it. They just get ahead and do it to a good first approximation. And I'm also in the habit of saying, and I forgot to say it here, that in all of this, the really important science, and there's a huge range of science, things in the physical sciences, things in the life sciences of trying to think, can we make more efficient solar panels using biological techniques? But the really crucial science is the social sciences that try to understand what you have to do to modify people's behaviour in what is ultimately their own long-term self-interest, but it only works if everybody does it and there aren't free riders. And one way of getting round that social science, which does tend to tell you that you want both sticks and carrots, more carrots than sticks, but there have to be sticks. One way to get around it is not to have a democratic process, but to have much more command and control process. Then on a small scale, you see that in Europe. One of the dissatisfactions of the Climate Change Committee in the UK is that the third part of the legislation, after it had fixed the idea of targets and the Climate Change Committee, it then, and to my mind, rather meandered off into a whole bunch of stuff that presumed that fiscal instruments were going to be the primary way of getting where you wanted to be. And if you look at, for example, wind farms in Europe, although Britain talks a much better talk, Germany and Denmark have done far better. And it's done in a somewhat more command and control way. I mean, it's nothing like China, but it's more to the China direction of just trying to persuade people to do it. So it's not a pleasing conclusion to come to.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you think will be some of the impacts of climate change on fragile states in particular?
Well, I think it's going to... I really don't have an informed answer to that question, but I would think it depends on why the states are fragile. So Sub-Saharan, one of the things is, you've got to realize there are some places that are going to be winners in climate change. It's not there are going to be winners and losers. There are going to be more losers than winners, and most of the losers are the countries that are worst off to begin with. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be particularly badly affected. And so there are places where states which already are fragile for a complex array of reasons are also going to be hit more seriously. But it's too complicated a question to admit of a unitary answer.
Hi, my name's Anthony Hobley. I'm a partner in the international law firm Norton Rose, and I head up the global climate change team. I've recently moved from London to Australia for a year. I guess there's one comment and one question. I mean, I've been involved in the carbon markets now for nearly 10 years and helped write some of the legislation in Europe and elsewhere. So I agree probably with 95% of what you said. The one thing I would maybe just sort of disagree is on fiscal instruments, particularly carbon markets and the carbon price. I mean, I've actually seen the power of that to mobilize entrepreneurs and innovation. And if we have if politicians have the courage to put in place a carbon price, the market will find the cheapest events, and it will mobilize literally tens of thousands, if not millions of people globally, and tap into that, that most powerful of human motivators to provide for your family and for yourself. And you just have to do that. You cannot command people to do what's needed to do. You have to motivate them. But I guess my question is, I was at Copenhagen and that whole logistical shambles, and I was negotiating for one of the EU countries, Lithuania. So I was right in the middle of that whole process, and coming out of it, I, like you, are trying to decide whether the Copenhagen Accord is a success or an absolute failure. But the one thing that those who try and argue it's a success, no one's really addressing, and I think the scientific community, has to step up and be more clear on this, is what are the consequences of us not doing this? Because at the moment, we are clearly, the Copenhagen Accord talks about a 2-degree target. If you look at all the commitments in there, we're nowhere near that, even if all the countries meet those commitments. So we're on a trajectory for something much higher. And that's fine, but what about the tipping effects or the runaway climate change and all of those things? Because that's what I fear is we get to a certain point and there's nothing we can do. We actually, at some point, whether it's 2020 or 2030 or 2040, we're beyond that tipping point, and whatever we do, we cannot reverse things. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Right, well, taking the first part of the question, I agree with you that if you can construct fiscal incentives of various kinds that encourage people to actually both be doing useful and constructive things in a way that benefit themselves, that's the best way to go about doing it. And I am not sufficiently expert to give an exegesis on some of the problems with carbon markets, because what I do know is that if you don't have a fixed floor, the EU, some of the things that have happened in Europe illustrate that you've got to think through that method a great deal more carefully than was initially done. And interestingly, one of the things that has come out of the Lib Dem Conservative coalition in the UK, one of their promises is to put a floor under carbon markets. And that's one of the prevailing things that may help fix it. At the same time, I do have a bit of an equivocation. It's all very well to say you can buy carbon credits to offset the things you do. But again, you have to look at some of those mechanisms quite carefully to make sure that the way you're buying a get-out-of-jail-free card for yourself really is going to deliver a corresponding benefit that's real. So I think great if you can be imaginative enough and careful enough to think of all the clever ways in which people can take the benefit without paying the cost, which is one of the things that we're very creative at doing. That's why I'm a little bit reserved about thinking of that as the major piece of machinery you use. And this second part of the question you asked, one word, remind me. Tipping points. Well, right at the beginning I said I wasn't going to go into that in detail. I just wanted to acknowledge that there are a lot of nonlinear processes where it is very difficult to say with any certainty at what point there is a tipping point. And to take just one of them, for example, if you think of melting of glaciers in general, and particularly the ice cap in Greenland. As a result of what's happening, we've learned how little we understood of the rate at which glaciers melted, and the complexities of the way the water that's between the rocks they're sliding over and the glacier actually lubricate the flow. So there's suggestion that that's something we didn't understand fully, and we're learning more about it. But if, as you do lose Arctic ice, and you change something bright and shiny that reflected photons back into space, and instead replaced it by darkish water that absorbed it, you have processes where you've got positive feedback. Again, there are uncertainties about the speed at which that works. And the reason all I'm saying here is one needs to be careful of admitting the things one is not certain of the rate of. And I think I am distrustful, or there is a tendency of some people to feel it's more effective if you give alarmist predictions about things like this. That will motivate people, and I think that's a mistake. It's much better, for all the fact that it may cut against the attitude of some people to feel more confident in it if you're giving them definite answers. Ultimately, if you're not sure, the best thing to do is to say you're not sure. And that's what's true of some of these things.
I do think it's important to get a better understanding of the severity of the risks. And one thing I've never actually heard mentioned in any of the commentary on it is, yes, we're going, we've written off a 2 degree centigrade increase, and business as usual might take a 4 or 5. If the average global temperature is 100 degrees, that's not a problem. If it's the average global temperature is 2 degrees, it's a big problem. What is the average global temperature now?
It's a very good question. I don't know.
The answer's 14.
It's odd.
The answer's 14.
Hmm?
The answer's 14.
Mm-hmm.
So 2% is a 14% rise in temperature. 4%, 4 degrees, which is more likely, is a 28% increase in temperature. So, as a physicist, what happens to a gaseous atmospheric system if you increase the temperature of it by, 25, 28%?
Yeah, well, the reason I don't happen to know, it's odd lacunae, I admit, what the average temperature is, and of just in terms of the change. One of the points that one of the genuine, and the word skeptic is used carelessly in some of these discussions, but in many ways one of the contrarians, Dick Lindzen, was a very useful and productive skeptic. And a friend of my youth, one of the things Dick emphasized is that while it may be useful to talk in terms of an average temperature, in fact, there isn't a meaningful average temperature. Excursions that may be a few degrees in one place, near the poles are swings of the order of 7 degrees, and so on. So what you really have to do if you're talking in detailed worries about a particular place is to try and get a sense of what is going to be the likely, for a given overall thickening of the global blanket, what is going to be the change in temperature and even more difficult rainfall in that place against what there is now. And that again is something that does complicate, once you get down to the detail you'd like, of talking about particular parts of the world. You can begin we know so much more now than we did 10 years ago, and so much more than we did 20 years ago. And again, there are those who find it uncomfortable to hear that there are still things we don't know, while at the same time you're saying we are sure, which we are, that there are going to be serious effects and they're caused by us and they're going to get worse.
I think that's very true, and obviously there's great variation, but it becomes particularly important to the social sciences you were talking about. If the population believes that this is a relatively trivial raise in temperature, 2 degrees, we're a warm country, so why are we spending all this money on it? The risks aren't as great.
But the answer to that, I think, is more to explain that while 2 degrees, or for that matter 4 degrees, might sound relatively trivial, the last time the world was 4 degrees warmer was something like 40 million years ago. Or to put it another way, the depth of the last ice age differed in average temperature from today by something like 4 or 5 degrees. So that these aren't small differences as global averages. And I think that is the important thing to emphasize, along with, and the other thing for public acceptance, I think, is it is important to emphasize that even if the world as a whole won't take the actions that need be taken, it is still in the interests, individual countries who do act are going to have benefits. So there are going to be benefits in Britain, for example, if we really do get back on the run rate, but others don't. There will still be benefits in that there will be greater energy security from a decarbonised electricity supply. There will be financial and other security benefits from a housing stock that is better constructed and better insulated, and that one is not appealing simply to altruism. And then more largely, if one really engages this and engages it in a productive and imaginative way, the industries it's going to create are going to put you in a stronger position in this changed new world where you're selling it out rather than buying it in. And that, on the other hand, is a not very, that cuts against the idea of asking what's fair shares for everybody to say here's a selfish reason for acting. So there's a bit of cognitive dissonance going on there, but on the other hand, isn't that what the social sciences are all about?
Harley Wright from Climate Sense. You spoke eloquently about what Britain is doing to deal with climate change. Would you care to comment on Australia's position of deferring its ETS trading scheme for 3 years, please, and what other countries might think of that?
I'll just make the one brief comment. I think it is unfortunate what has happened in Australia relatively recently, and the thing that I think is particularly unfortunate is that what has happened in the Senate, which is a textbook example of one of the disadvantages of proportional representation, but what has happened in the Senate is a coalition of people who deny the reality of climate change, along with people who are passionately recognising the need to deal with climate change and other environmental problems, the Green Party, people whom my instincts are to resonate with completely for their concerns, but have mixed these genuine concerns with an overriding desire to feel good about themselves so that they'll actually obstruct useful legislation because it's not perfect. And there is a real challenge for the social sciences to try and understand how people can behave so stupidly.